Well, we have, at long last, landed in Rio de Janeiro, but pushed the clock right back, past the Samba schools and past the Sambadrome. What we're gonna do right here is go back, way back into time, but not so far that the only people that existed were troglodytes. And yes, that is a Jimmy Castor reference if you get it. Back to Rio. It's the season just before Lent, and the street is a weapon. There is a smell first, perfume, cheap and sharp, hanging in the air. Then a wet smack. Somebody, 2 balconies up, has hurled a little wax ball, sealed and filled with scented water. And it has burst against the shoulder of a stranger. Laughter. A bucket goes over a railing. Flour and powder come down like a cloud. A jet of water from a hand pump catches a man square in the back of the neck, and he spins around, half delighted yet half furious as well, already reaching for something to throw back. And here's the thing you have to feel, right at the start. Some of the people in this street are playing, and some of those in the street cannot afford to be hit, because this is a city built on slavery, inequality. And the soaking that is a joke between two equals is something else entirely, when the person throwing and the person on the receiving end are not equal in the eyes of the law. The same splash of water means freedom for one, but danger for another. Well, this game, it has a name, Entrudo, and the authorities have been trying to ban it for decades, yet it is stubborn, refusing to die. And that is where Rio's Carnival begins for us today. Not with a school, with a fight over who owns the street itself. I am Maicão, and this is Samba Stories, a show about Samba Enredo and the Carnival of Rio de Janeiro, but for people who love the spectacle yet have never been told what sits underneath it. And the thing I say at the top of every episode, because this is really important to me and essential to how we work. Everything I say in this episode is based on my current understanding, my current knowledge. That understanding may change as I learn more, even tonight or tomorrow. Being human means I may miss an essential piece of information, or that I draw a connection that turns out to be incorrect. This podcast is my ongoing effort to learn and understand. It is not a final word. Now, last episode I promised you that when this story left Bahia and came south to Rio, it was going to get rowdier. Well, here is the rowdy part. Before Samba and Rio's Carnival ever found each other, and that wedding is the next episode, not this one, Rio already had a carnival. A loud, crowded, contradictory carnival, with no Samba schools in it at all. And I have to plant the flag here before we take one more step, because this is exactly where people misinterpret history. The temptation is to line these historic forms up like a ladder, Entrudo on the bottom rung, something a little more organized above it, and something a little more modern above that, and then the Samba school standing proud at the top as the thing they were all evolving into. Please throw that ladder away. It did not happen like that. These forms lived at the same time. They borrowed from each other. They fought over the same crowds and the same corners. The historians who study this are blunt about it. The trap is to force these carnivals into a neat evolutionary line, where one supposedly gives birth to the next. They didn't. So here is the framing I want in your head all hour. Rio's Carnival was not one festival politely changing clothes. It was several carnivals arguing over the same streets, over who got to appear in public, in what costume, under whose rules, and even with whose permission. So here is how I want you to listen today. Every time I show you one of these carnivals, ask 3 questions. Who is allowed to do this in public? And who gets arrested for doing the very same thing? Who is calling it civilized? And who are they calling disorderly? And, the one that matters most for where we are going? What piece of machinery, or what piece of the machinery of a parade is getting built here? Because by the end, all of that machinery gets inherited. Keep those 3 questions running at all times. Before we go one step further into the streets of Rio, I want to answer a question this series has quietly skipped over. Where does Carnival even come from? Because the Samba schools are Brazilian to the bone. Yet the festival they parade in really isn't. That was imported. Carnival at its root is a Christian invention, or more exactly a Christian frame built around a very practical need. In the Catholic calendar, the 40 days before Easter are Lent, a long stretch of fasting and penitence, when the faithful traditionally give up meat and dairy and fat, and rich food of every kind. And if a fast like that is coming, you have an immediate problem. A larder full of precisely the things you are about to be forbidden. So you hold a feast. You eat it all loudly, together, in the last days before the fasting even begins. That blowout is Carnival. The name says so out loud. Our best reading traces Carnival back to the Latin carne levare, to take away the meat, the moment the meat gets pulled away for Lent. You will also hear it told as carne vale, farewell to meat, which is a lovely phrase, but probably a later gloss. Yet it points at the very same thing. One last feast of the flesh, and then the fast. Now, you will very often hear this pushed a great deal further back, that Carnival is really ancient Rome in disguise. The old festivals of Saturnalia or Lupercalia carried forward in Christian dress. Please be a little careful with that one. It is a popular story and it may hold a grain of truth, but the documented line from a Roman festival to the medieval Christian one is rather thin. Historians genuinely argue about it. So, for my part, I will give you the part that is solid, or defined. By the Middle Ages, right across Catholic Europe, Carnival was a fixed season before Lent. Masks, feasting, and a burst of permitted excess before the long fast, kept everywhere from the canals of Venice to the smallest mountain village. And it traveled wherever Catholic Europe traveled, which is exactly how it reaches us in Brazil. Because Catholic Europe traveled to Brazil in Portuguese ships. The carnival that would one day carry a samba school down an avenue did not grow up out of Brazilian soil. It came off a boat in the hands of Portuguese colonizers in the early centuries of the colony. And the particular form it arrived in already has a name. In fact, we have been standing right in the middle of it. Let us go back to that street. The game is called Entrudo, and here is the direct line to what we just heard. Entrudo is not a Brazilian invention, it is Portuguese, through and through. The word itself traces back to the Latin for entrance, the entrance into Lent, the blowout right before the fasting starts. Not the deep breath before the plunge, but the explosion followed by deafening silence. And back in Portugal, Entrudo was already exactly this kind of a thing. A rowdy pre-Lenten street game, played here for centuries. In much the same shape it would take here, with, in some regions, masks and grotesque characters thrown in on top. The Portuguese colonizers carried it across the Atlantic in the 16th and 17th centuries, and it took root in the colonial streets of Brazil. Rio made it its own, but it remained firmly rooted in the Portuguese tradition. It ran on things you could throw, water by the bucket and the syringe, powders like flour, starch, ground lupin, and the famous one, little wax balls about the size of a small lemon, sealed and filled with perfumed water. They even had a name for them, the limão de cheiro, the scent lemon, made by the 100,000 to be thrown and burst. And here is a detail I love. As often as not, it was the women of the house who made those wax lemons, and who started the whole thing. It happened in the street between strangers. And it happened inside the house too. For example, between family, friends, servers, servants. Oh, at a rougher, more intimate thing that you actually might be picturing. It could be flirtation as well. It could be a game between children. It could be an excuse to humiliate somebody. Quite often, like all good things, it was a nice little blend of these. Now, I told you at the top that this game was not equally safe for everybody. And let's be clear as to why, and not just wave at it. I also want to kill a myth while I am here. There is an old romantic idea that Carnival was the world turned upside down. The one time of year when the social order flipped and everyone was equal. The records we have do not support this. Entrudo respected the hierarchy of Imperial Rio rigidly. The respectable families played it privately, indoors among their own kind, within their own social circle and standing. Out in the open street, it was a very different game, with different people, different players. And in a city where one person could legally be the property of another, the play carried a completely different charge depending on who was holding the bucket. I'm not reading today's politics back onto those people. I'm telling you how their world was arranged, in their own legal terms. Because that arrangement is the thing that made one splash of water sometimes mean two different things, completely different things. Here's the part that tells you the most, and it is a documented part. The authorities, in all honesty, hated Entrudo. They thought it filthy, dangerous, bad for the image of a modern capital. So, what did they do? They banned it. The city council issued its first edict against it in 1838, and then it just kept issuing them. There are police notices and ordinances stacked up right across the 1800s. One that the National Archive singles out from 1854 is a police memo begging the Minister of Justice for 100 soldiers to patrol the streets and stop the game before Carnival even arrived. And here's the payoff. If your first ban is in 1838 and you are still begging for troops in 1854, and the thing is still going strong at the turn of the century, the bans are not really evidence that it stopped, right? They are evidence that it did not. A law you only have to pass once is a law that worked. A law you pass over and over and over is a portrait of something in the city that it could not get rid of. Entrudo did not politely exit so that a nicer carnival could take its place. It got pushed, renamed, and partly tamed, yes, and it bled into everything that came after. Also, do not let me turn it into a cartoon either. It was not only charming, as much as it was not only cruelty. And hold this for the next part. The people who wanted it gone were not automatically more refined. They simply had a different carnival in mind. One with a roof, a ticket, and much better press. Now, picture the people who looked at that street, who winced. Rio's elite, its merchants, its newspapers. A city that desperately wanted to be seen as a modern, European-style capital. They did not want to abolish Carnival, no. They wanted a different one. And starting around the middle of the 1800s, they began building it. First, they took it indoors, masked balls borrowed from Paris and Venice. They were ticketed, costumed, set to European dance music, held in theaters and clubs. Carnival, you could put a velvet rope around. Carnival with an entrance fee, which quietly tells you exactly who it was for. And then, out in the street where they could be seen, the grandes sociedades, the great societies, organized clubs, mostly elite and middle class, who paraded on purpose. The famous ones, the Finianos, the Democráticos, the Tenentes do Diabo, they were such fixtures that they survive in name to this very day. They brought costumes, they brought music, and they brought their signature weapon, the carros de crítica, the critique cars, big allegorical floats, built to make a satirical point. A float that mocked a politician, a float that jabbed at the church, a float that argued about slavery, or the monarchy, or the issue of the day, rolling down the avenue like a moving newspaper cartoon. Hold on to that one, because it is a piece of machinery, a float that carries an argument, a parade that is trying to say something. We're going to meet that idea again, transformed, when the Samba schools turn an entire avenue into a thesis. And also, do not file these clubs away as merely rich people playing dress-up. Their politics had real teeth. Some of the great societies were openly abolitionist, and in the years before slavery ended, a few of them literally bought enslaved people's freedom and presented them, newly freed, as part of the carnival parade. Sit with this for a second, because it is the kind of thing the tidy version erases. The same elite world that ran this carnival was not one simple thing. It could push a campaign to clean up the streets and stage an abolitionist gesture in the very same season. Which brings me to that campaign and to a specific word the newspapers used. They called this the civilized carnival. Civilized as opposed to the barbarous, disorderly Entrudo of the street, of the people. Now listen closely, because I am not going to say that word in my own voice, and let it stand. Civilized here is not a neutral description. It is a claim made by particular people in particular newspapers with a particular interest in deciding whose carnival counted as respectable and whose counted as a problem to be dealt with. Read those old sources and you will find that word everywhere doing a job. The job is sorting people, so I will report that they used it, yet will not hand it to you as being the truth, the objective truth. It was their truth. The respectable carnival kept modernizing though. Added imported props to prove it, confetti, paper streamers sold by the armful. A whole little economy of carnival merchandise, marketed as the clean, fun, up-to-date way to play. Throw a paper streamer, not a wax ball. A more viable alternative to banning Entrudo. Replace the rough street game with something you could sell. And it worked, partly, because the street did not go quiet. In fact, it was about to get way louder. Because, while the balls and the great societies were getting the good press, the popular street, Poor Rio, and the big share of it of course, Black Rio, was running its own carnival. And it was inventing far more than anyone gave it credit for. Again, I have to be straight with you about a problem buried in this part of the story. Almost everyone who wrote it down at the time disliked the people in it. The records that survive, police reports, newspaper columns, they mostly come from people looking down. They were describing these groups as noise, as a nuisance, a menace, as something exotic, yet also somewhat frightening. So when I describe these forms, understand that I am reading hostile witnesses, and I'm trying to see past their hostility. Keep that in mind every time I tell you what one of these things actually was, because in the end I am often telling you what an enemy believed it to be. So, quickly, some of what was out there, and it really was a mix. The Zepereiras, there were bands marching behind big bass drums, the bombo. Pure percussion and absolute noise and forward momentum going down the street. These actually came up out of poor Portuguese immigrants, and the historians call them the seed of Rio Street Carnival, the origin. Then the Afro-Brazilian forms, the cucumbis, black processional groups, Congo traditions with their own characters and costume and dance and instruments, were performing African-derived material in public. You had the cordões. The word means cords, and that is literally how they worked. A roped-off group moving through the crowd with music and masks, a whole cast of characters, often a king and a queen, drums and whistles. And these drew heavily and openly on Black Rio. Out of that same world came the blocos, the blocks, neighborhood groups, the loose local street carnival unit that, in a changed form, is still the engine of Rio Street Carnival to this very day. Now here is where I want to push back on the old sources directly. It would be easy, reading those hostile witnesses, to file the black groups under victims, people that things were done to. Do not do this. The scholarship that has gone back and read it, or read those records against the grain, shows something the police columns missed. These people were organizers. Around the end of slavery, abolition came in 1888, black popular groups used the street and the carnival season to do something really powerful. To appear in public on their own terms, to perform their own memory, to mock the powerful, to stage who they were in a city that would rather they stayed invisible. That is not a victim. That is an artist and a citizen using the one big public stage available to them. The drums in that street were not background. They were part of a claim. And tucked inside of this loud, underestimated street is the form that is about to hand the future its blueprint. Because not all of these groups were random in setup and unstructured. One of them was getting organized, with banners, an order of march, a story. And that massively important one, is up right now. If you want to find the blueprint the Samba schools were built on, here is the surprise. You do not find it in Samba. You find it mostly in the Ranchos carnavalescos. The word rancho just means something like a band or a group of people. And these particular ones grew out of a religious procession. The Ranchos de Reis, the King's Ranchos, tied to the Christian feast of the Three Kings of Epiphany in early January. Devotional groups that sang their way through the streets toward the nativity scene. Over time, that devotional procession got pulled into Carnival and turned into something new, the Carnaval Rancho. The name that comes down to us here is Hilário Jovino Ferreira. The son of freed slaves, he came to Rio in 1872, settled on the Morro da Conceição. He identified himself as Bahian and is remembered as one of the migrants who carried samba into the capital. And in the early 1890s, he founded his own rancho, the first one to take itself out and parade at Carnival, which set off a citywide fever for this really new experience. Its name has come down to us in 3 different forms, however, and for the sake of history, I will just give you all 3. Reis de Ouros, the King of Diamonds, the card suit. Reis de Ouro, the Golden Kings, and in Hilário's own telling later in life, Rei de Ouro, the King of Gold. The sources do not agree. I would rather hand you the whole knot than pretend it's settled. Now, 2 honesty notes. First, the fine print on the man is genuinely contested. Sources cannot even agree whether he was born in Bahia or in Pernambuco, or whether the year was 1855 or 1873. They're even split on whether the rancho launched in 1893 or 1894. Some of this is documented history. Some of it is the founding story of a tradition which it tells about itself. I'm giving you the through line, and I'm flagging the blur. But here is the second note, and it is the important one for us. Jovino is credited with bringing into Carnival 3 things the Samba schools would later inherit whole. The Enredo, a story the parade is built around, string and wind instruments, and the flag-bearing couple, the Mestre Sala e Porta-Bandeira, who got their own episode much later. Keep it in the back of your mind. It is a direct line here, because now look at what the rancho actually was, as a machine, and watch every single part of it. The rancho had a banner, a standard, an emblem the group marched behind. The very thing that announced, "This is who we are." It moved in an order, not a mob, a procession organized into sections. It had costumes, coordinated, designed to a theme. It had a story, and not a simple one. Those who left us the chronics of the time watched ranchos being full narrative spectacles, themes lifted from opera and literature, things like Verdi's Aida or Dante. It had a particular music, slower and more melodic than the frantic drumming found in the wilderness of the streets shore. A tempo that even earned its own name, the Marcha Rancho, the Rancho March. And it presented all of that in public, to be seen and more judged against its rivals. Now please, read that list back to yourself. A banner, an ordered procession in sections, themed costumes, a story the parade is telling, a signature music style, public competition. That is a Samba school. This is the entire skeleton of a Samba school, decades before the first of those even existed. The schools did not conjure that grammar out of thin air. They inherited a chassis from the ranchos, but dropped a different engine into it. The fast Estácio Samba we will come to, and they built something new on a frame that was already standing. And one piece of respect before we move on. The rancho is not just a rough draft of something better. It was its own complete gorgeous form, with its own sound and its own devoted followers. Celebrated groups like the one remembered as Ameno Reseda, a rancho so admired that it was literally received at the presidential palace. Calling it pre-Samba school is a thing we do, because we are looking backwards, as we already know how this story will end. The people inside of that rancho, they were not waiting to become anything. They had only just arrived. And there is one more carnival in this crowd, and it shows up driving. In the early 1900s, you get the cursos. Processions of cars and carriages, rolling slowly down the grand avenues. They were full of well-dressed people, tossing steamers and showing off. Carnival as a parade of automobiles, which around 1910 was about the single most modern and most expensive thing a human being could possibly be doing. The corso is the elite and the rising middle class announcing, our carnival has technology. We have technology. And they had somewhere brand new to drive it, because right at that moment, roughly 1903 to 1906, the city truly tore itself open. Rio's government drove a massive urban reform program through the old center, knocking down whole blocks of the crowded, poor colonial downtown. They nicknamed it the Bota Baixo, the knock it down, and cutting a wide, straight Parisian-style boulevard through the middle of it. The Avenida Central opened in 1905 and later renamed Rio Branco. And here is why a podcast about Carnival cares about the demolition project. When you rebuild a city, you rebuild its festivals, because you have changed the very stage. That shiny new avenue became the showcase for the respectable carnival, the corsos, the great societies, the parade the city wanted photographed. And the demolition had a second effect that matters even more for us. It pushed, literally, thousands of poor residents, many of them black, again as usual, the very people running that loud street carnival, up the nearby hills and out to the suburbs, swelling the city's first favelas. Hold that quietly, because the hills and the neighborhoods those families landed in, well, they are exactly where, a handful of years later, the Samba schools are going to be born. The bulldozers were, without meaning to, drawing the map for the next chapter of this story. And all over it, the same hand we met with Entrudo. Licensing, permits, policing. Which carnival got the nice venue and the permit, and which one got moved along. That was decided, it always was. So now, look at what is standing in the street at the 19th century makes way for the 20th. The wax ball game that would not die, the ticketed ball and the satirical float with the good press. The loud, brilliant, watched-over popular street. The organized rancho with its banner and its story. The cars on the new boulevard. All of it in a short span of time. All of them arguing. And here is the one thing I most want you to carry out of this episode. When the Samba school finally arrives, it is going to walk onto that avenue holding a banner, moving in ordered sections, wearing costumes built to a theme, even telling a story. It is driven by a signature beat and competing in public to win. Not one piece of that is new. The banner, the procession, the costume, the narrative, the music, the contest itself. Rio's Carnival had already invented every single one of those, in the ranchos and the cordões and the great societies and in the streets. The genius of the Samba school was never that it invented the parade. It was that it took all these scattered pieces and the new sound coming down from the hills and fused them into the most powerful version anyone had ever built. But fusing them took a particular place and a particular group of people. It took a house in a neighborhood near the docks, run by a Bahian woman whose name you are going to need to know. It took the families who had come down from Bahia carrying that circle we sat inside of for the last 2 episodes. It took a corner of the city called Praça 11. Next time, the 2 great rivers finally meet, Samba and Rio's Carnival, and the Samba school will be born. That is the wedding. This was everything the city already was when the bride arrived. So the next time somebody tells you the Samba school simply is Rio's Carnival, you will know the fuller, longer truth. The Samba school is just the heir. And before the heir, there was a whole loud century of fighting over who the street belonged to. I am Maicão, and this has been Samba Stories. Thank you so much for listening. If it gave you something, a like and a comment are much appreciated and help these stories reach more people. And please do subscribe, because next time the bride called Samba finally arrives. Até mais!